A whisper drifts across centuries, a question carried through deserts, across oceans, through the halls of empires, and the quiet corners of ordinary homes. Who were the men who walked beside Jesus of Nazareth? Their names echo in paintings, sermons, textbooks, and half-remembered childhood lessons. Yet the truth behind those names is stranger, more human, and more dramatic than many realize. 12 men, some obscure, some fiery, some fragile, one fatally conflicted, whose lives would unravel into one of the most influential movements in history. But before they were disciples, they were fishermen, tax collectors, political agitators, brothers, skeptics, dreamers. And in many ways, they were remarkably ordinary. Picture them. Men caked in dust, breathing in the dry Galilean air, carrying nets that smelled of brine and sweat, trudging through villages where Rome's shadow loomed heavy. None of them imagined that their names would be remembered 2,000 years later. They thought only of daily labor, family tensions, debts owed, uncertain futures. And then a wandering rabbi with a piercing kind of compassion looked them in the eyes and simply said, "Follow me." For reasons that remain partly mysterious, they did. Their story begins not with their greatness, but with their smallness. Because the astonishing truth is that the movement that reshaped the world began with men no different from the ones passed by on any crowded road. And that's what makes them worth understanding. Not as saints carved in stone, but as people. Let's walk through their lives one by one, tracing the threads of what made each man unforgettable, whether by courage, by passion, by intellect, or, in some cases, by tragedy. Simon Peter was the first to step into the spotlight, though he hardly seemed destined for it. A fisherman from Bethsaida, rough-handed and impulsive, Peter lived with the burdens most working men carried in Roman-occupied Galilee. Taxes that bled him dry, unpredictable livelihood, the constant grind of seas and storms. He had a temper that flared like a torch dropped in dry grass, and his confidence often outran his wisdom. But he had something that set him apart: fierce loyalty. The morning he first encountered Jesus is painted today as serene, but it was likely chaotic. Boats creaking, men barking orders, nets dragging with the weight of failure from a night of catching nothing. Yet Jesus stepped into Peter's boat, taught the crowd from its edge, and then told him to cast the nets again. The catch that followed was so large the nets nearly tore. Peter fell to his knees, overwhelmed. Jesus simply said, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will catch men." What Peter is remembered for most is not that moment, but the way his heart vacillated between boldness and fear. How he leapt out of a boat to walk on water, only to sink when fear overtook him. How he swore unwavering loyalty, then denied knowing Jesus 3 times in the chilling hours before dawn. And yet, it was Peter who became the movement's pillar, the one early Christians called the Rock. His life was a paradox of weakness turned into strength, and for that, he became unforgettable. Then there was Andrew, Peter's brother. Andrew is often overshadowed, a quiet figure beside a louder one. But he was the first of the 12 to follow Jesus, and the one who brought his brother into the fold. Andrew had been a disciple of John the Baptist, searching, questioning, restless for something more. When Andrew first heard John say, "Behold, the Lamb of God," he followed Jesus without hesitation. His personality was different from Peter's: calm, where Peter was volatile; thoughtful, where Peter was impulsive. But Andrew had a distinct trait: he brought people to Jesus. Again and again, in some of the most understated moments, Andrew introduced newcomers: curious Greeks, a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, his own brother. Andrew is remembered above all as the quiet connector, the one who opened doors for others to step into history. James, son of Zebedee, strides into the story with thunder in his veins. He was a fisherman like Peter, working alongside his brother John. Together they were known for their intensity, their quick tempers, their bold demands. Jesus nicknamed them Boanerges, the sons of thunder, a title that hints at fiery personalities beneath sunburnt skin. James witnessed some of the movement's most electrifying moments: the raising of Jairus' daughter, the blinding brilliance of the Transfiguration, the agony in the garden. He was often in the inner circle, close to the heart of the story. But James's legacy is unique in another way. He became the first of the 12 to be martyred. King Herod Agrippa I, eager to please factions of Jerusalem, had James executed by the sword. James's sudden death shocked the early community, a reminder that the path they had chosen was not one of safety. He is remembered for his bold devotion and for being the first among them to seal that devotion with his life. John, his younger brother, would outlive them all. If James burned like lightning, John's flame burned long and steady. Known later as the beloved disciple, John began as a young man full of zeal. Early on, he shared his brother's thunderous spirit. He once asked Jesus if he should call down fire from heaven on a Samaritan village. But time softened him, and his writings reveal a man transformed by love. John's memory is tied to theology more than to action. He became the voice of a spiritual vision that emphasized compassion, unity, and profound mystery. He is traditionally credited with writing the Gospel of John, 3 letters, and the apocalyptic revelation. Whether or not these attributions reflect historical authorship, the tradition signals how early Christians saw him as the contemplative, the mystic, the one who leaned close to the heart of his teacher. John is remembered most as the disciple of love, the last living witness of that first generation whose voice shaped Christian thought for centuries. Next comes Philip, the practical one. When Jesus called him, Philip immediately sought out Nathanael, saying, "We have found the one Moses wrote about." Philip had a mind that worked through logistics and numbers. When faced with feeding 5,000, Philip didn't marvel at the crowd. He calculated costs, muttering that not even half a year's wages would be enough. Philip's practicality sometimes made him cautious, sometimes literal to a fault. Yet he possessed a sincere desire to understand. His most memorable moment appears in a request. "Show us the Father," he asked Jesus, longing for clarity. The answer he received, that seeing Jesus was seeing the Father, has echoed through theology ever since. Philip is remembered for his earnest, sometimes puzzled searching, a representation of the questioning heart. Then Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew, steps into view, skeptical yet sincere. When Philip told him about Jesus, Nathanael's first reaction dripped with skepticism. Can anything good come from Nazareth? A blunt assessment of an insignificant village. But Nathanael went to see for himself. When Jesus greeted him, calling him a true Israelite, in whom there is no deceit, Nathanael was stunned. That single sentence cut through his skepticism. Tradition remembers him as a man of integrity, and later stories, though historically uncertain, cast him as a missionary who carried the message as far as India or Armenia, before meeting a brutal martyrdom. Whether fact or legend, the memory of Nathanael rests on his honest, searching faith and the transformation of a skeptic into a devoted follower. Matthew's story is one of the most dramatic reversals. He was a tax collector, and in 1st century Judea, that title meant collaborator, traitor, extortioner. Tax collectors worked for Rome, profiting from their own people's suffering. They were shunned, despised, and often feared. Picture Matthew sitting in his tax booth when Jesus passed by. The crowd's eyes narrowed. No respectable rabbi would approach a man like that. But Jesus did, and with 2 words, "Follow me," everything changed. Matthew hosted a banquet soon after, inviting other tax collectors and so-called sinners. The religious elite were scandalized, but Matthew's response was simple. He believed he had been given a chance at redemption. Tradition attributes the Gospel of Matthew to him, though modern scholarship debates this. Still, his legacy stands. Matthew is remembered for radical transformation, the man pulled from corruption into purpose, whose life became proof that no one is beyond calling. Thomas enters the story surrounded by whispers of stubborn realism. He is remembered unfairly as Doubting Thomas, but that nickname oversimplifies a complex man. Thomas wasn't a cynic. He was a loyalist who needed clarity. When Jesus decided to return to Judea, where danger lurked, it was Thomas who said, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Those are not the words of a doubter, but of a courageous realist. Yet, after Jesus' death, when others claimed to have seen him alive, Thomas refused to accept their word. Perhaps he feared being hurt by false hope. Perhaps he needed something tangible. When Jesus appeared again and invited Thomas to touch his wounds, Thomas responded with the most direct confession recorded among the disciples, "My Lord and my God." Tradition later associates Thomas with missions stretching into Persia and India. He is remembered for his honest questioning and for a faith that emerged stronger through doubt. James the Less, also called James the son of Alphaeus, remains a quiet and shadowy figure. The epithet, the less, likely refers to his younger age or smaller stature, not importance. The Gospels say little about him, yet early tradition identifies him with the influential leader James of Jerusalem, though modern scholars question this link. Regardless, the memory that persists is that of a humble, steady disciple, overshadowed but faithful. He is remembered not for dramatic acts, but for quiet presence, representing the many followers in history whose contributions go unseen yet remain vital. Thaddeus, also known as Jude or Judas, son of James, steps into the narrative briefly but memorably. Confusion persists because of his overlapping names with Judas Iscariot. So many traditions prefer calling him Thaddeus. His most notable moment comes during a question he posed at the Last Supper. Why Jesus would reveal himself to his followers, but not to the world. His question was sincere, seeking understanding of a mission that seemed too quiet, too hidden. Tradition later remembers him as a healer, an intercessor for hopeless causes, and a missionary who preached courageously in difficult regions. While history cannot confirm these details, the character of Thaddeus shines as one who sought clarity, asked questions others were afraid to ask, and carried compassion into action. Simon the Zealot brings a sharp edge to the group. The title Zealot may refer to an affiliation with the radical Jewish movement that resisted Roman rule, sometimes violently. If true, this means Simon once might have stood on the opposite ideological side from Matthew the tax collector. One man fought Rome, the other worked for it, yet they found themselves sitting at the same table. Jesus brought together men who in another life might have despised each other. Simon's transformation from political insurgent to spiritual ambassador is one of the movement's most striking contrasts. Tradition places him in distant lands, preaching and eventually dying for his beliefs. He is remembered for passionate commitment, redirected from political revolution to spiritual mission. And then Judas Iscariot. His name has become synonymous with betrayal, but the deeper story is tangled with complexity. Judas was trusted, so trusted in fact, that he carried the group's money bag. He lived beside Jesus for years, heard every teaching, witnessed every miracle. And yet he broke in the most catastrophic way. Why? Theories swirl like dust in a storm. Some believe Judas was greedy, tempted by 30 pieces of silver. Others propose political motives, that he wanted to force Jesus into a confrontation with Rome. Still others imagine disappointment, confusion, or disillusionment. The Gospels portray him tormented, unraveling under the weight of his actions, ultimately taking his own life. Judas is remembered tragically as the betrayer, but his story remains a chilling reminder that proximity to greatness does not guarantee understanding, and that even those closest to the light can fall into shadow. These 12 men, fishermen, skeptics, zealots, brothers, friends, enemies turned allies, walked dusty roads behind a rabbi who offered no political power, no wealth, not even safety. What he offered instead was vision, a kingdom not built on force, but on compassion, not on walls, but on welcome. And each disciple, in his own flawed and human way, responded. Some spread the message across continents. Some died for it. Some wrote words that would be clutched in the hands of believers for millennia. One betrayed it. One doubted. One loved with mystical fervor. One thundered with passion. One held the purse. One quietly supported the others. One turned from corruption to faith. Together, they became the foundation of a story that has outlived empires. Their memory endures not because they were perfect, but because they were not. They were frightened, uncertain men who stepped into something far larger than themselves. Their courage grew alongside their confusion. Their faith was not steady, but forged in missteps and redemption. And that is why, after 2,000 years, their names still echo. Because their story is not merely about who they were, it is about what ordinary people can become when called to extraordinary purpose.